Yesterday, July 4th, our nation celebrated the traditional date of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This day in 1776 for America, much like our church's 19th of June, 1770, is usually commemorated with great crowds and fanfare as a birthday of something important. What is it that we celebrate on the 4th of July? When we get down to it, it's not much different from what we celebrate on the 19th of June. The declaration of a new standard representing a revolution in thought and allegiance. In both instances, however, we celebrate something that does not exist, but instead is an ideal that is ever coming into being. The Declaration of Independence includes these words embedded in our national consciousness. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. These truths, however, were not made evident to the millions of black people held in the bondage of slavery at the time. These rights were tucked away from the nation's women, who had limited access to property, education, independence, and their franchise. This consent was made foreign to those indigenous peoples who became alienated from the very land that once was theirs. And even so, these values captured in our Declaration of Independence were held as the new standard for this new nation. And people have striven to secure them more perfectly ever since. This past month in the United States has been filled with great unrest. Awakenings and conversations on inequalities experienced throughout the land. Cities have turned into demonstration platforms, while governments have been in the precarious position of having to balance in both hands the protection of rights, the protection of property. Curfews have been instituted to help bring calm to the streets, to separate principled protesters from those who are merely the makers of mischief and far worse. And there has been varied response to their efforts. And it's clear that protesters and activists will not be silenced. They are emboldened even now by the values of the Declaration, and they are protected by the Constitution of our nation. This great extended unrest might seem to some like a failing of the democratic principles of our nation. However, the doctrines for the new church tell us that a collective group, such as a nation, is a macrocosm of the individual. And each individual has something within them that the doctrines call a proprium. This is the source of our experience of selfhood, which is initially rooted in the love of self and love of the world. It's what makes it so that we have a sense that I have an ending and you have a beginning to who you are. That there is such a thing as mine, and that there ought to be such a thing as yours. This is what makes it possible for us to have individual and communal identities and plans, hopes, and dreams. Now, for those who already know about this proprium, or this perception of selfhood, it often has a bad connotation, because the doctrines frequently present it as pure love of the self, pure love of the world, the source of all evil. And this is because of warnings against leaving our propria untrained and immature. However, the doctrines also tell us that if we try to live only in the Spirit and neglect the things that are natural in our lives, that we become like a house that's lost its foundation, that eventually would crack and crumble. From this pulpit last week, Reverend Glenn spoke on this necessity of life. And this proprium, this sense of self, is also what makes it so that we can detect when we're being harmed, when we're being limited, when we're being taken advantage of, when we're being controlled, when we're being oppressed. It's the part of us that makes us respond with upset and indignation, sometimes with anger and rage, or even protest, when we or our people, whatever that means to us, are threatened. It's what makes it so that we can keep our balance as individuals in a society of many, eventually conserving the harmony between the push and pull of life. It makes it so that we can keep track of our rights and our responsibilities. When people are together as a collective unit, whether it's in the collective identity as a married couple or as a family or as a city, as a nation, as a church, the proprium is the source of our ability to have pride, our ability to be a community, to be able to inventory the needs and the things that we have to take care of to make sure that we're all okay. It makes it so that we can respond to trials and hurts, like how a town might rally together to stop the advance of a highway that might divide their community, or how a nation can rise up in time of war to support each other in that effort. And yet, this same proprium, this sense of self, that can make for such ordinary and extraordinary demonstrations of sacrifice and camaraderie for oneself and for one's people, well, it has another side to it. It can make us as individuals indifferent to the suffering of those who are not our own. It makes it possible for us to put our interests, both individually and collectively, above the needs or even above the rights of others. It's what can lead to communities looking down their collective nose at others. It can make for nations to take advantage of other weaker sovereignties. It can lead churches and faith groups to believe that they are exclusively the people of God and everyone else quite literally be damned. It can lead to individuals and collectives to believe that their way of life is the best way, or their culture the best culture, or their perspective the best perspective, their expertise the best expertise, their political party the best political party, their heritage the best heritage, or even their race the best race. Much like freedom is a double-edged sword, the proprium, that sense of self, can be the same. That mechanism which can bring us together to focus on our collective needs and protection, it can also drive us apart. What determines whether community or ostracization will occur is, well, what is most important to us? Or, in other words, what rules us? Speaking of rulers, the great irony of Independence Day is that we celebrate the deliberate dissolution of our ties with one ruling government in favor of the ultimate establishment of a new ruling government. Our independence, which we celebrated yesterday, was accomplished by significant acts of lawlessness and rebellion. Now, from the perspective of today, most Americans would agree that this was the right call. However, the internal deliberation and the strife within the Second Continental Congress, as well as within every regular person in the colonies leading up to the Revolution, that was very real. Uncertainty about how to go. And this tension is captured in the newspapers and journals of the day. It's captured in memories of family divide, fathers against sons and in-laws against their children's chosen spouses. The tension in the colonies was real. The hurt that they harbored in their reality was real. And from this hurt, a flashpoint in history, the Boston Massacre, exploded out of the hidden energy of that tension. Now, despite its name, only 5 men were killed in the Boston Massacre. The first to fall was a dock worker by the name of Crispus Attucks, a man of Native American and African descent. Word of this event eventually was spread around the nation, and it stirred the people, eventually leading future President John Adams, who had been in Boston during the event, to reflect that on that day, quote, the foundation of American independence was laid. Many events and offenses led to the Declaration of Independence, which we celebrated yesterday, of which the Boston Massacre is just one example. Small skirmishes here and there became all-out war, complete and total revolution. The British colonies of North America, no longer wishing to be subservient to England, outlined their grievances. They made polite, dignified supplication to their king to honor their wish to separate and to exist alongside them. Quote, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. End quote. The Second Continental Congress channeled the American proprium with this document. And when King George refused to acknowledge their sovereignty, the nation, our nation, stood firm in their demand for autonomy, respect, and equal footing on the world stage, and threw themselves on, as they put it, the protection of divine providence, and risked their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor, and officially were in open revolution. The American revolutionaries demanded a change. And they demanded a change because, above all, they had something that we all are called to have. Something that serves as an extension of the proprium: self-respect. And what is self-respect but a willingness to believe in our own potential, that we're born for good things? What is self-respect but our willingness to love who we are and believe that we are worthy? The Lord calls us to have this, each of us. He calls out to us in His Word, asking us to take care of ourselves, to hear that He loves us, to care for our bodies, minds, and souls. And, much like the proprium has 2 sides, self-respect can go too far. When it tips the balance and becomes a disrespect of others, it goes too far. When it causes us to dismiss others, it goes too far. When it becomes a disrespect of others, it goes too far. And when it turns into a contempt and disgust of others who are different, it goes too far. And when things go too far, we require a revolution. The doctrines for the new church tell us that our sense of self must in time be put away in favor of something better. Our selfhood is limited. Our proprium is natural. And without change, we will always treat ourselves as being the gold standard of humanity. But if you're like me, you know that you're not perfect. But there is one who is perfect. We must take on the Lord's standard. Learn to see the world and other people through His eyes and from His sense of self. He calls us to take on His ways, which are higher than ours. He asks us to have a revolution of our own hearts and minds, each of us individually and collectively. The doctrines for the new church, penned not long before the Declaration which we celebrated yesterday, they spell out terms of their own, which are radical and revolutionary, in and of themselves. They tell of a sundering and a separation, the end of an old Christian church, one corrupted and overbearing, one disconnected from the values and understanding of the divine, one that had shattered God in three and made charity of no importance. The doctrines of the new church tell a story of a new and independent spirit, one not of a new nation, but of a new Christianity. Their spirit, rebellious and radical, tells of a new way of being people. They tell of a new heart that we each can have, one where our selfishness and worldliness take a back seat to our care for the neighbor and our love to the Lord. These documents of church and of country, they have much in common. They both tell a story of high expectations for future independence, for separation from what has become harmful and a hindrance, for dreams of freedom, true freedom and responsibility. And neither of them is a guarantee. In a way, the doctrines of the new church spreading throughout the world is not much different from a copy of the Declaration of Independence packed away on a ship bound for London. They're both imbued with bold, audacious, and at the time of their advent, radically revolutionary dreams. And neither of them secures for anyone their vision. Must we have the full roadmap established to be confident in a vision? From declaration to realization? From doctrine to New Jerusalem descended? No, how can we? Who can know what tomorrow will bring? But we must set our course by some guiding light, the northern star of our values and hopes, the rising sun of our better tomorrow. And we must do this despite being inclined to evils of every kind. As our executive bishop, the Right Reverend Peter Buss, reminded us in his letter to the church in response to the racial unrest around the murder of George Floyd, he said, "We have available to us vital perspectives from the heavenly doctrines, that variety is a part of perfection, and that each soul is an angel in the making, loved by the Lord. A particular teaching has demanded attention in my mind at this time," the bishop writes. It states that, quote, "evils cannot be removed unless they appear," end quote, a quote from Divine Providence 278. The thing that led me to this passage, the bishop says, is the rejecting part. The Lord doesn't cause evil to happen, but can work with us to abhor it when we see its destructive nature. We are seeing that rejection in our country at this time, and that is as it should be. Part of the work of setting our sights on a better future is contending with the obstacles, challenges, threats, and enemies that stand between us and that better future. And this is true for our great nation. When we set our sights on the lofty promises of the goals of the Declaration of Independence, when we enact the rights and privileges and responsibilities set forth for us and by us in our Constitution, the very document which gives us the right to assemble, to worship, and to believe as we would today, we enact this vision. In the United States, we value the consent of the governed. We heard it in the selection from the Declaration of Independence. We feel it every day. And these days, we hear the voices of our friends and our neighbors, the voices of hundreds, the voices of thousands, the voices of tens and hundreds of thousands, the voices of generations crying out in the streets. We hear them calling for justice. They state that they do not consent to being treated as second or third class citizens, but rather as equal members of the body of this nation. They demand that their brothers and sisters be treated the same. They declare their independence from old harmful systems. And they work to incite revolution of hearts, minds, and ways. In a community, just as in a body, if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. And we are called in this church to be mindful of the whole body of our church. We're charged by our Constitution in the very spirit of it to be mindful of the whole body of our nation. We're charged with the selfless love of the Father in heaven who calls us to love one another as he has loved us. And if Jesus, God himself, while on the cross, could call for the forgiveness of those who rejected him, of those who persecuted him, of he who betrayed him, of those who arrested him, mocked and scourged him, humiliated and tortured him, of those who set themselves as his enemies, of those who crucified him. If God, the one with every reason to condemn, could find it in his heart to forgive, who are we to hate any of our brothers and sisters in this national body? His declarations were radical. Jesus called for a revolution of heart. I think of his parable, which I read this morning, the parable of the Son of Man judging the nations. We must see ourselves in this parable, not look away. As individuals, as a church, as a country, there have been times when we have been righteous, and there have been times when we've been accursed. There have been times when we've been loving, and there have been times when we have left the sick uncared for and the imprisoned unvisited. But inasmuch as we have done it to the least, we have done it to the highest. So what does that mean for when we've left it undone? Whether we are speaking of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Ten Commandments, the Beatitudes, or the doctrines for the new church, these are tall orders. But they're tall orders for our souls and our spirits. They're tall orders for the salvation of all people and the creation of a heaven from the human race. They're tall orders for our hearts, and if we are to fulfill them, we must ever strive to do better. It's not enough to make a declaration. It's not enough to craft a constitution. It's not enough to know a doctrine. It's not enough to hold a Bible. These are simply the beginning. Our proprium, our selfhood, is in us as a tool to aid us in this journey through life. We must have access to the love of self and the love of the world, the pride and the self-confidence and the self-love and the self-worth and the self-respect to look at our past and see how far we've come, to be proud of our accomplishments, to be proud of our growth. But at the same time, we must have the humility to look forward and see how far we have to go, how we all still fall short of the glory of God, and even so, are called into greatness in him who made us and governs us and guides us and seeks our acceptance of his will and his way. The Lord tells us that things will be hard when we pursue what is right, that families will turn on each other on account of commitments to what is right. He tells us that sufficient for each and every day is the evil thereof. And he tells us that there are many opportunities for destruction as we go. And still, he tells us to set our sights on the sunrise of a better tomorrow. Our nation has been in a state of unrest and weeping, but there is joy promised in the morning. We must, each in our own way, find it in ourselves to feel the grief of our brothers and our sisters, the heartache of a nation, not to hold those who hurt in the murder of contempt. Social media is almost like a training ground for this. It's given us an unprecedented opportunity to hear from each other, to see both great displays of dismissiveness, contempt, and hatred, and at the same time, exhibitions of compassion, growth, knowledge, love, forgiveness. Protests and counter-protests, demonstrations and letters, videos and books and articles and conversations and sermons are happening. And there is conflict, to be sure. I'm sure I rubbed some of y'all the wrong way this morning. But as the proverb says, iron sharpens iron. We find ourselves right now fighting in the battlegrounds of ideas and values. But at some point, we must beat these iron swords of revolution into plowshares for farming. We must turn from our destruction of old harmful systems to the development and growth of new and better ones. And we can do this in the Spirit of the Lord if we're willing to find unity in the human points of contact in our topics of passion. We as a nation, as a church, and as individuals must make our declarations and see to our revolutions. Amen.